Hello, and welcome. My name is Elly Desmarchelier. I have copper red hair and I'm wearing a navy blouse. Welcome. I'm a proud disability rights campaigner and we're back for another open dialogue. For those who have not been to one, think of it as a live show where you control the conversation. It is designed to be inclusive, accessible, collaborative, respectful, but more than importantly, fun. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather. I'm on the land of the Yuggera and Turrbal people. I want to recognise their continued connection to the land and waters of this beautiful place and acknowledge that they never ceded to sovereignty. I respect all durable elders and ancestors and any First Nations people here today. So we have a great playlist for how things are going to run tonight. We're going to have a live update from Canberra from our national reporter, Emma Myers. We're going to get hot takes from our terrific panel of Todd Winther and Luke Nelson. We're going to deep dive into the government's response into the Royal Commission with our special guest, Sophie Cusworth of Women with Disabilities Australia. And we'll have a think about where to from here. Of course, we have our civility feedback tool. If you haven't attended one of these events before, you can either log in through your phone or use the link in the chat. We know a lot of you will be watching this as a recording, and the good news is you can enter your thoughts too. We'll have the feedback tool open for the next fortnight, although we're yet to master the time travel, so your results won't show up in the feedback. You'll see a QR code appear on your screen, and there's also a link in the chat. For those using a laptop, grab a mobile and use the QR code as it appears on the screen, or click the link in the chat. Fill out the questions and hit submit when you're ready to move on to the next question. It's designed so you can move at your own pace. Jump on now and let us know you're ready to go by hitting the heart button. You'll give people a few seconds to jump on and get to our first question, which is always an icebreaker. We always start with an icebreaker, which tonight I want to know, if you could have dinner with a historical figure, who would it be? I'll bring in our panel. Todd, historical figure, who would you have dinner with?
Hi everyone, I just wanted to let you know that I am 40 years old. I have short brown hair and I'm wearing a light pink business shirt. What the historical figure I'd like to have dinner with is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the most significant US president of the 20th century, who also happened to be physically disabled. Not only did he save the United States from the Great Depression, but he also helped the Allies win World War II, all from the seat of his wheelchair. So he's a very inspirational figure to me, and I'd like to have dinner with him.
Great choice. I love that the first one that came up is RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. What a choice. We've got some incredible people. Winston Churchill, Shane Warne, of all people. That's a choice. What about you, Luke? Who would you have dinner with?
Thanks, Elle. Well, I'm wearing a blue shirt, I have brown hair, and I'm 35 years old. I think Nelson Mandela would be fantastic to sit down and have a conversation with.
Incredible. That would be amazing. I'm going to choose someone living who's historical, and that is, I could not go past Michelle Obama. I would love dinner with Michelle Obama. I know, like, of the Obamas, it's kind of hard to choose which one, but Michelle, I think, would be both politically insightful and give you the gossip, and and have all the backstage stories for me, and just be incredibly powerful. I would love to sit down with Michelle Obama. What about you, Emma?
I'm torn between Frida Kahlo and the woman who created the staff teddy bear, because she had a physical disability, and she ended up supporting her two brothers and her entire family, and after they all lost their jobs. So she's a great woman to admire. But my favorite one is Frida Kahlo, just because she had such energy. Many people don't know that she was also a woman with a disability, and just the fact that she got to interact with so many historical, influential people.
I see someone said Stella Young or Ellie Cole, great choices. Helen Keller and Buddha and Jesus is coming up. Princess Di, that would be quite the tea. Virginia Woolf, and someone's chosen Barack, so I feel a little bit better that we didn't leave him off. So those are great choices. Thank you for deep diving into my icebreaker and taking that seriously. The way we want to structure these dialogues is to have an open discussion on issues that interest our panelists, and then deep dive into a specific issue. First up, we're really lucky to have our special Canberra correspondent, Emma Myers, joining us from the National Parliament. Emma has a background in screen and media, but tell us a little bit about yourself and your job and what you've been learning about in Canberra.
So my name's Emma Myers, for those, and I have blonde hair, blue eyes, and a blue blazer. I'm 30 years old, and I'm a disability rights and political reporter in the press gallery at Parliament House. And
Incredible.
So I've recently started at this job. I was previously a screenwriter, and a journalist with the ABC, and I honestly cannot figure out how I ended up here. But I'd just like to say that I'm having a great time, and I love posing questions that make people think about disability in a different light.
Yeah, absolutely. And my question for you is, as our Canberra correspondent, I want to know what it's like getting around the big halls of our nation's parliament as a member of both the press gallery and a member of the disability community. How's it going? Is it accessible?
It is accessible. I think in a large part thanks to Senator Jordan Steele John. Alas, I think he's a senator. I've forgotten. My mind went blank for a second there.
Yeah, you've got it right.
Yes, I spend all day looking up ministers and senators. So, yes. So thanks to Jordan Steele John and his advocacy, the layout of Parliament House has changed significantly for people with different requirements. I've made a change myself to just the outside of Parliament House, in that we're getting a ramp put into one of the bus stops out there.
Yes.
Because I had to drive my chair on a very busy road halfway down to get onto a really uneven car park, and getting up onto the curb with a lot of rabbit warrens, so it wasn't accessible, and but they're changing it because they
You're there.
they didn't realize how they didn't realize how dangerous it was for people who couldn't dart across the road.
Yeah. I'm
Uh,
interested to know you're questioning the leaders of our country a lot on disability issues, and posing the hard questions. How do you want the broader disability sector and people with disability interacting with you to support your work? How do you want us to help you?
Please reach out to me via LinkedIn or Instagram. I am always looking for new topics to pose to the people in power, and or just raising awareness of just everyday stories of everyday people, and then I do apologize. This isn't the best time for me during the afternoon.
That's okay.
I have low energy, sorry. And yeah, honestly, I'm there to be a voice to for the disabled community, and I'm here to help and here to listen any way I can. You know, the week that the Royal Commission response came out, I spoke to, I don't even think it was less than 7 CEOs of prominent organizations to see what could be done, and to see what my position could how my position could help. So I'm open to anything you want to bring to the table.
Fantastic. And how do we follow your work, Emma?
Again, on Instagram or LinkedIn, I post everything I do there. If you're after a collaboration, I do that as well. I'm really just open to any opportunities that come my way, because we all need to band together to create change. It doesn't, like, one person could start change, but it requires an army to actually enforce it.
Absolutely. And you've got a big shout out in the chat. There's plenty of people saying you're awesome. Thanks for reporting and advocating for us. So you've got plenty of fans. Thank you for giving us a bit of insight into what it's like in Parliament. And you're going to stay around for our hot takes. So next up, as you can see on the screen, is our hot take segment of this event. We're going to be joined by Todd and Luke Nelson. Now that our panelists have joined us, we've already had introductions, so let's go straight to Todd's first provocation and his hot take. Todd, we learnt the government
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Sorry, it's Priscilla here. The spotlight's on. So sorry. Thank you.
No worries. Todd, we learned from the government that we won't be getting a Disability Rights Act anytime soon. But what's the difference between a Human Rights Act and a Disability Rights Act, and which one do you think is better?
Well, thanks for the question, Elly. What the Royal Commission recommended was a specific Disability Rights Act, because as most of us would be aware, there were over 10,000 people gave testimony in the Royal Commission on disability issues. And what with the overwhelming evidence, people with disabilities didn't know what their rights are, or if they did know what their rights were, they didn't know how to exercise them properly. So one of the key things the Royal Commission recommended was the Disability Rights Act, more as a political tool, so that a disability rights lens could be gathered through all the policies that a federal government would implement. A key part of that recommendation was to have a federal portfolio of a disability rights minister, so he or she could examine all those policies around the cabinet table, arguably the most powerful organ of policy in the federal government, to examine it from a disability rights perspective. Human Rights Act is more of a legal mechanism to give the Human Rights Commission legal authority to seek justice and legal consequence through breaches of discrimination. So that is a crucial difference between the two different legislations. What the federal government actually said was that we couldn't have a Disability Rights Act because there was an argument where some people with disabilities wanted a Human Rights Act by itself, and some wanted a Disability Rights Act. But as I argued in a recent article, why can't we have both? We need to have the Human Rights Act to look at our issues through a legal objective and a legal authority, but we also need the political power to force change.
So you argue that we need both
We
a
need both,
Disability
yes.
Rights Act and a Human Rights Act.
Yes, one complements the other.
Yeah. And Luke, what are your thoughts on this?
I actually read Todd's piece today from the that he wrote, and I agree. I think we need both a Disability Rights Act, but also from a Human Rights Act. But I'll say this: I think, you know, it's great to have both, but I think one thing that I'd say is, as long as people with disabilities know how to use it and know where to go to get access to it, and make sure that it's all in accessible language. Because I think it's very important to have it, but if nobody knows how to use it or get access to it, then we could have a major problem.
Absolutely. Emma, like, there are a lot of groups, even outside of the disability sector, lots of sectors who are pushing for a Human Rights Act and have been pushing for a Human Rights Act for a long time. Is there actually any political appetite in Canberra for enacting a Human Rights Act?
Look, I think there's always been an appetite for a Human Rights Act, but it's a case of getting everyone on board and taking it as seriously as we think it needs to be taken. You know, it's all very well and good for politicians to say, yes, I agree with you, but we need more than just a nod of the head. We actually need to see action, and yes, there's been calls for a disability centric department and a disability centric minister, but at this point in time, the government is more concerned about fixing disability related issues within the sector in different areas, rather than combining all these intersectional areas to create one massive department. And
now We're going to discuss this in our deep dive into the Disability Royal Commission as one of the areas where we've got a hard no, and maybe have a deeper look into the issue of a Disability Rights Act. But Todd, what do you want people to leave on knowing about why we should be pushing for both? What's the key message in a 30-second takeaway?
Well, I think the fact that the federal government only agreed to 6% of the recommendations in total, and the activity of federal parliament and the way that they passed through the NDIS legislation the past week suggests that people with disabilities need to have more of a political voice, and we need to examine how we can do that in the most effective way possible.
Right. Very clear. Now, Luke, you want to talk about the Disability Royal Commission, and you're wondering if we were to have another Disability Royal Commission, is there anything we would do differently? What have we learnt? So why is it that you came up with that provocation? What are your thoughts?
Well, the interesting thing around that is that I was thinking about it the other day, and I'm thinking, you know, if we were to have it again, what have we learnt? Or what wouldn't we do that we've done this time that we wouldn't do next time? And I would say, now I'm a big fan of social media. I'm a big fan of campaigning, but I think one of the things that we've got to be really, really careful of is there was a lot of social media around, right, what the recommendations could be, right, not what they actually were. So when people were saying, you know, it will be this, it will be that, a lot of people got frightened. A lot of people got scared, and a lot of people were running off with misinformation. So I would hope that if we did it again, it wouldn't be like that. Because I think one of the things that we cannot do in any government is we cannot predict. We can campaign as much as we want. We know that. Everybody has the right to campaign. Everyone has the right to have their say. And I'm the biggest advocate for free speech. But I think one of the things we need to learn from this is we cannot pre-predict what the government was going to do. We can talk about it, but not in the way that some of the members of our community were talking about it. So I just think we have to be careful about the language we use and the way we deliver it.
Maybe like suggesting that it was going to happen rather than it was just a recommendation.
Yeah.
And so it confused people,
Exactly.
thinking things were going to happen that didn't end up happening.
Yeah.
Is that what you're suggesting, Luke?
That's exactly what I'm suggesting, yeah.
Yeah. Todd, I'm a bit 50-50 on the length of the Royal Commission. I understand we had so many issues that we had to look into in order to really, you know, actually look into violence, abuse, neglect, exploitation, you know, and we had to deal with COVID. So there was a lot out of our control, but it was an incredibly long Royal Commission. And part of me wonders whether we lost the national attention with the fact that it was so long. And in doing so, we lost government attention as well. Do you think that how long it was maybe impacted how it was perceived, or am I on a wrong course?
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Elly. Part of the problem of the Royal Commission was that although the issues were comprehensive, the structure of how it was set up and delivered was set up to fail in part because the scope of the Royal Commission was so broad. I understand from a government's perspective as to why they set it up that way, but the fact that it didn't have one or two unifying themes to capture the media's attention throughout such a long period was one of the reasons it fell in and out of the mainstream consciousness. One of the things that I was concerned about, and maybe Emma can speak to this, was that the media's coverage of the Royal Commission was focused on the horrible instances of abuse and the trauma that people with disability suffered, and not necessarily on what the Royal Commissioner's input was. They tended to focus on what their commissioners disagreed on rather than a way forward in the disability sector. So a future report or a inquiry has to have a bit of a narrow focus and one or two unifying themes to gain real traction, unfortunately.
Emma, I'm interested in your political take on if you can imagine a world where the Disability Royal Commission was set up by the previous coalition government, right? If it was set up by the current government, how do you think they would set it up differently?
Well, firstly, I think that the current government was always for a royal commission. We saw way back in 2017 when they weren't in power that they were all for it and they were committed to a royal commission. In contrast, the Liberals voted down the possibility of a royal commission not once but twice. So I think that if the Labor Party had have started the royal commission, I think that it would have been planned out a bit differently, and more care would have gone into how as Todd said, they tried to focus on such a broad scope. I think they needed to bring it back to some key issues that rather than focusing on everything at once, because if you do that, then you're just going to fail at everything because you're not specifying what you particularly want out of. Sorry, I'm rambling. But I will say that I think that the Labor Party would have approached it differently. As I said, the Liberals didn't want it to begin with, so I think when they announced it, it was close to an election, and they were worried that they wouldn't win the election, so they tried to gain favour. But I don't think they just kind of chucked it at us and said, "Here, go ahead." I don't think there was any significant thought put into it until well into the process.
Yeah, Emma's point there.
And can I be cheeky enough to say I think the commissioners would have been different, which would have changed the whole process. But what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think Emma's last point there is the key one. It was at a key moment of the political cycle. Scott Morrison's leadership was hanging by a thread at that stage, that the Liberal government wanted some social policy credibility, and that was part of the agenda as to why the Royal Commission was implemented, and it speaks to the breadth of why it was created in the first place. So as we've all said, it needed a bit of a tighter focus.
And I will also add that Scott Morrison's faux pas in front of the disabled community by saying I'm so blessed to have 2 healthy children was in the same week that the Royal Commission was handed down.
Interesting.
Timing is everything, right? All right, well, on to something very different. I thought I would share a happy snap of my own from this weekend. I had my 32nd birthday. I don't know if we've got the photo to pull up. I hope we do. There's me on the dance floor. But it sparked a couple of conversations, which is what my provocation is. How do we allow disabled people to take enough risks? Now, I firstly, when talking about this party a few days before, I had a support worker inquire if I was going to drink alcohol at my party. And she was quite surprised when I said yes, as she had only worked in group home environments where her clients were not allowed alcohol no matter what their age. And then secondly, on the night, I was cutting it loose on the dance floor in my chair, as you do, when a favorite song came on and I wanted to stand up and dance. Now, I was wearing very impractical gold heels and incredibly unsteady on my feet, but I wanted to stand. I am stubborn, so I did. Luckily, the people around me supported my decision, and even though it wasn't the wisest one, and I knew it in the moment that I was taking a risk. But I also knew that the people around me would have easily said, sit the hell down. I was just lucky to have people that didn't. But that isn't the case for many people with disability who are clearly denied a drink on their birthday or not allowed to stand and dance when they want to. Todd, in an attempt to keep people with disabilities safe, have we gone too far and taken choice away?
Well, we're all familiar with the NDIS here, and I think taking risks is a natural extension of the choice and control rhetoric. We talk about choice and control, and taking risks is part of creating choice. So if you've lived in an environment like a group home and you haven't had exposure to choice, you haven't gone through the process of self-determination, which is making a choice. And part of making a choice is learning how to take risks and deciding for yourself what is a good choice and what is a bad choice. Because by making mistakes and by making good choices is how we learn, how we grow as a human being. So even if that risk didn't pay off and you were wearing that gold heel and you got a little tipsy and you ended up falling over, at least you learned from taking that risk and was able to fully exercise that choice and control. So taking risk is all about moving from that rhetoric of choice and control and making it a reality.
But we don't give people with disability the right to make a mistake, do we? Like,
No,
we're not allowed to make mistakes, because then everyone looks back and goes, oh, well, we should have put all of these safety controls in place, and that will never be allowed to happen again.
And that's the point exactly. If we're part of the inclusion solution for people with disabilities, we have to move to a culture and environments where people with disabilities can take risks, because wrapping us up in cotton wool does us no favours whatsoever.
Luke, what does this story make you think about?
I think, I've got the battle scars. I've in Europe, I fell out of bed, and one thing that my support worker says, okay, I'm going to, I will support you in whatever you want to do, but, they treat me like a human being, which I think, if I'll take one of the situations where when I went to Europe, all my friends went, but it's Europe. You're going to a place where it's inaccessible. And I said, well, it's my choice. It's my choice to go through Pompeii in a wheelchair that broke down. So I think we are a risk assessment society, but I think we need to loosen up a little bit. Like, yes, there's risk, but there's risk in everything. You know, if you don't live life, you're going to go through life being paranoid about making mistakes. But isn't the most enjoyable thing about life making the little mistakes? So you go, okay, that was fun, but I'm not doing it again.
Emma, does this remind you of anything you've been through, and how do you reckon we get the balance right?
Well, it reminds me of the time I almost got kicked out of a pub because someone thought I was drunk, but I wasn't, just disabled.
I think that's happened to like every person with cerebral palsy ever.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think also on that, I think, you know, we just need to also refer back to supported decision making. I mean, encourage people to have supported decision making in their plans. Support, like, say, all right, talk about it with your support worker, talk about it with your members of staff, but encourage everybody to be involved in the conversation.
And on attitudes, we have a question from Annabelle, which is actually on our last issue, but it goes to this. Do we think the Royal Commission in any way has changed attitudes? Has there been a positive impact in any way of changing attitudes in society from the Royal Commission? Can I do a quick round? This is a question from Annabelle in the chat. Todd?
Absolutely not, because of the way that external factors such as the media, such as the powerful political parties treated the Royal Commission. As I said before, the fact that only 6% of the recommendations were adopted by the government tells you in how much high regard the Royal Commission was put. So unfortunately, hopefully it leads to long-lasting change, but at the moment, I'm afraid it didn't do much at all.
Luke, your thoughts?
I think, you know, I agree with Todd. I think that we're in a society where risk is, we're not too safe, but we're getting to the stage where if we do get wrapped up in cotton wool quite a bit, I don't know whether it's for the fact that we're people with disabilities, but we need to also say to the people around us is, I'm a human being too. You know, I want to live my life. I want to live my life and have choice and control and freedom. That's what it's about.
And Emma, do you think it made any kind of impact on community attitudes, the Royal Commission?
Attitudes, no, but I think it did make people more aware of forced sterilisation of people with disability. When I released that story, it went around to all of my colleagues around the country, and there's about 52 of us, and in those offices they did an impromptu survey, and no one knew that this was still a legal thing that was happening. And since then, and since the story's gone out, I have heard that you know, people, the average Australian is quite shocked by that, but we'll have to see whether the attitudinal issue changes.
All right, well, that's a perfect point to start our deep dive. And tonight we're looking at what can only be described as an underwhelming, undeveloped and half-hearted response from the federal government to the Disability Royal Commission recommendations. To help us wade through the 130 recommendation responses, we're joined by our special guest, Sophie Custworth from Women with Disabilities Australia. Welcome, Sophie. We'll bring Sophie to the screen.
Thanks, Elly. So good to be here. I'm happy to give a brief visual description of myself before we start. So I'm Sophie. I'm a young white woman with dark brown hair. I've got dark brown eyes and I'm wearing a green blazer and a white t-shirt. Thanks so much for having me join you.
Thank you so much for being here. Now, tonight, I refuse to sit in the gloom. We are going to take a look at some of the top line items fell in the response. We did make progress. I promise you, we're going to look at where we did make progress. We're going to look at where we're stuck in bureaucratic jungle and what we got a hard no to. Then we're going to get straight onto where to from here. How do we get some of the stuck recommendations forward and some of the no's back into the maybe column? It's time to turn our heads to some good old-fashioned campaigning. But let's be honest, Sophie, disappointed is an understatement. How are you feeling about the Disability Royal Commission recommendation response?
Yes, I think a lot of us have felt incredibly disappointed and pretty devastated reading the report. I know that I had a cry reading the response, and I actually wasn't involved in the space throughout the substantive work in the Royal Commission. So I can only imagine the sheer disappointment and devastation from the community who gave so much to this inquiry. As everyone here will know, the Royal Commission heard harrowing stories from people with disabilities for over 4 years. And prior to that, many, many advocates in our community worked tirelessly for the Royal Commission to be established. So for many, it was really devastating to see only 13 recommendations accepted in full by the federal government, with so many accepted in principle or subject to further consideration. And I think for those of us who work in this space, the experience is both incredibly personal, but it's also professional. And that can be really hard because we had to sort of receive the response and grieve while reading it, but then set about responding, and writing statements and speaking to media and strategizing on where to from here. So I think, like you, Elly, I really want to hold space for the genuine devastation and disappointment that people are feeling, but also work out, how do we find a way forward?
Absolutely. I think that is an incredible way to start off and to really go from. But I think it's really important that we find a way forward together and that we come together as a community in response to this, because collaboration is the best way to do this. So I'm really keen for you to talk us through the headlines. Why don't we start with the good news? Where did we make some progress?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have chosen 3 different recommendations where we felt that, or where I felt that we made progress, and there might be more that other people feel, but here are some sort of topics that I thought were relevant. So the first one is funding for advocacy. And the Royal Commission obviously saw how critically important independent disability advocacy is in protecting and promoting the rights of people with disabilities. And the Royal Commission made a number of recommendations regarding disability advocacy, including for extra funding, as well as funding that's long-term and stable. Because what we know is that many disability advocacy organisations don't get enough funding. They have a lot of unmet need, so really long wait lists, or they have to turn people away. And they also get a lot of short-term funding, so funding that only lasts for a certain amount of time, and then they need to apply for more funding. So government's response was that the government has committed $39.7 million in additional funding to establish a new individual disability advocacy program. And the new program aims to bring together current services to establish a streamlined and cohesive model of ongoing individual advocacy supports. And this is a really, really welcome commitment. As I said, we really saw how important advocacy was throughout the Royal Commission. So I think this is a great thing.
Amazing. What would you say number 2 with progress would be?
Yeah, so we also saw the Royal Commission make a number of recommendations to reform the Disability Discrimination Act. And this is so important because we know that the Disability Discrimination Act is not working in the way that we need it to protect and promote our rights. And this is for a whole range of reasons, including that it relies on people with disabilities to enforce our own rights when we've experienced discrimination in a system that is often not accessible, often really expensive, and for many people is a really traumatizing process. So some of the key recommendations from the Royal Commission around this would see a positive duty placed on organisations to eliminate disability discrimination. And it would also see a recognition of systemic discrimination. So this would mean that we wouldn't always place the onus just on people with disabilities to make sure that we're not being discriminated against. And the government's response was that they have committed $6.9 million for disability discrimination law reform to undertake a review of the Disability Discrimination Act in consultation with our community. And this, again, is a really welcome commitment. It's something we desperately need and have been asking for quite some time. So this is really wonderful. The only thing I'd say, though, is that we hope that government will work with us to engage with the really significant work that has already been done by the community to think about the Discrimination Act and to really talk about what needs to change.
Great. So there's not just a commitment to change the law there's some money behind it. That always means they're looking to actually get it done, which is fantastic. And I know the next one we've made some progress on is really important to WIDA. So tell us about that. Yeah,
absolutely. So the third one I wanted to talk about is the commitment to applying a disability lens to the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. And this is really important because we know that women with disabilities experience gender-based family and domestic violence at higher rates than people without disabilities, but we also experience unique forms of violence at the intersection of our disability and our gender. And the Royal Commission made a recommendation that the government develop a 5-year action plan for women and children with disability to accompany the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. And it was recommended that this plan be developed by and for women with disabilities, which is fantastic because nothing about us without us. And that it prioritise the cohorts of people with disabilities that experience the greatest risk of violence, and that it coordinate with other relevant policies and plans and strategies, like the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Action Plan and Australia's Disability Strategy. And in terms of government's response to that recommendation, the government has committed to applying a disability lens across the first action plan in the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. This is a little bit different to what the Royal Commission recommended because the Royal Commission recommended a separate action plan for women and children with disabilities. But what government is committing to doing is applying that disability lens across the main action plan. So looking at the main action plan and its actions and saying, how do we make sure this meets the needs of people with disabilities? And this one is kind of a controversial one, and I want to acknowledge that it's a bit controversial because there are mixed views in the community. So in our advice to the government, Women with Disabilities Australia said that it's really, really clear that women and girls with disabilities need to be prioritised in the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. But we said that we need to consider whether a separate action plan could achieve this, or whether it risked the mainstream violence prevention and response systems and services effectively saying, well, that's a disability issue, so the disability sector can handle it. So in our view, it's so important that that violence against women and girls with disability be understood as gender-based violence and included in the mainstream prevention and response plans that exist for everyone, so that the experiences that we have are not just put aside to the disability sector to manage. And I think this particular recommendation and the commitment brings up one of the issues that we navigate a lot of the time, which is our community needs specific action to meet our needs, but we don't always want to have separate action, because sometimes we create silos where people with disabilities and our needs are sort of met in a separate space from everyone else. And I think we need to recognize that segregation from the broader community is at the heart of so much of the harm that we experience. And we don't want to perpetuate that further with policies and programs and services and systems, but we also really need targeted action for our community. So there are some really challenging things to balance here. But what I think we should do with this response is focus on ensuring, and I think this has come up in the chat, that this disability lens is applied really effectively and inclusively and is led by people with disabilities.
Amazing. I think you've explained that incredibly well, and that understanding of why including a disability lens in the mainstream policy is important. Just to our panel quickly, what stands out to you in that making progress headlines? Todd?
I think, as Sophie mentioned, the changes to the Disability Discrimination Act are really important, because everybody, well, most people in the political sphere and in the advocate sphere know that the Discrimination Act exists, but it's not being enforced, or it doesn't have enough teeth to gain momentum. So I believe the changes that the Royal Commission recommended will hopefully help to do that.
Great. All right. Well, Sophie, the next section is with the muddy bit. Where are we stuck in bureaucratic land? The accepted in principle parts, where we've got a lot of those. We've got a lot of bureaucratic jungle. But give us your top three where you think it's important for us to know.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one that I want to mention is something that Emma spoke about just before, and that's forced sterilisation. So for those who aren't familiar with this, forced sterilisation is where someone's ability to reproduce is removed without their consent. And unfortunately, this is still lawful in Australia. And as Emma mentioned before, that's really kind of unknown in the rest of the community. A lot of people expect that this wouldn't be allowed in Australia, but unfortunately it remains lawful, even though it has been recognised as a form of torture and a form of violence. So this is a really significant issue for our community, because we represent women, girls, and gender diverse people with disabilities who are more likely to experience forced sterilisation. And our organisation has advocated for it to be prohibited, so unlawful, for many, many years. And the Royal Commission considered this issue and recommended that the Australian government and the governments in states and territories make sure that there are laws that prohibit sterilisation, except where there's a threat to someone's life, or where the person with disability is an adult and has given their consent to having the procedure. Now, the government said in response to this recommendation that they will further consider the issues raised by this recommendation. And they spoke about the differences between different legal frameworks across different states and territories. But only 2 states actually accepted this recommendation in principle. And the Australian federal government said that because sterilisation is a surgical procedure, state and territories would be responsible for these changes to the law. And it said that the federal government doesn't have the jurisdiction or the authority in relation to sterilisation of adults, and that that's the responsibility of states and territories. Now, this is a challenging one because it goes without saying that forced sterilisation is a significant violation of human rights. And the United Nations treaty monitoring bodies, so these bodies that monitor governments' commitments to international human rights, have described forced sterilisation as a form of violence and torture. And these monitoring bodies have also said that where a government like Australia has signed up to a human rights convention, like the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, they're still responsible for implementing that convention, even if they have states and territories that have their own governments with their own powers. And what that means is that the federal government still has a responsibility for enacting legislation across the country to make sure that it complies with the convention. And they need to make sure that state and territory governments have the right resources to make sure they're implementing the convention. And this one is a challenging one in Australia because the Australian government also needs to act within our constitution, which does talk about the responsibility of state governments and Commonwealth governments. And so we understand that the Australian government has said there are reasons in the constitution why we don't have the authority to make these laws. Now, we are, of course, really, really disappointed to see that only 2 states have accepted this recommendation in principle. And we need to see all Australian governments across all states and territories working together to prohibit these practices that do constitute gender-based violence.
Absolutely. Firstly, I just want to, that was an incredible summary of a very complex issue. So thank you, Sophie. You're doing an amazing job. Firstly, I just want to apologise. We did have some slides that explained these things, but we're having technical issues. So firstly, thank you for your patience in getting these slides. Oh, here we go. Our easy read slides are working. That's always helpful. I also look, I'm just going to have a real conversation with you, which is, I know this has been a really hard, difficult, fearful time in the disability community, particularly over the last week and a half. And we are all feeling it in incredibly different ways, and that is being displayed in the chat tonight in how people are responding. And I understand that we are all processing this in different ways, but can I just implore us to, no matter how we feel, come at this in a really respectful way towards each other. You know, political stances are totally justified, but making sure that as a community we are working as much together as possible is what the disability dialogue is all about. It's about collaboration, it's about innovation, it's about working together, and that's the spirit in which I hope the chat keeps running, because I understand everyone's feeling it, and the best way to overcome that feeling is by reaching around and coming together rather than pulling apart. So, Sophie, on that note, what have we got in the jungle next?
Absolutely. So the next one that we've chosen is segregation in the context of employment and housing. And the Royal Commission recognised that segregation is a key driver of violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And it made a number of recommendations regarding segregation in housing, employment, and education. And I'll speak about the education recommendations a little bit later in the next section. So in terms of housing and employment, this included a recommendation to develop a plan to support people with disabilities who are working in Australian disability enterprises, otherwise known as ADEs, to move to inclusive, open employment options in a whole range of settings. And this recommendation was accepted in principle, with commitments to initiatives to support this. But some of the commissioners also recommended that the Australian government develop and implement a roadmap to transform Australian disability enterprises and eliminate sub-minimum wages for people with disabilities by 2034, so within the next 10 years. And this was listed as subject to further consideration. In terms of housing and segregation in housing, some of the commissioners also recommended that the Australian government and state and territory governments develop and implement a roadmap to phase out group homes within the next 15 years. Separately, a different commissioner recommended that the Australian government and state and territory governments commit to phasing out group homes in stages. And the government response was that this is subject to further consideration. It says that the Australian government and state and territory governments support the development of a range of inclusive housing options for people with disability that support us to exercise choice and control over our living arrangements. So the recommendations to end segregated employment and segregated housing are subject to further consideration. And that means that they haven't been accepted in full or necessarily accepted in principle, but that the government is still working to analyse them and consider them and have a think about where to from here. And the response acknowledged that ADEs, or Australian disability enterprises, shouldn't be the only employment option for people with high employment support needs. But it said that ADEs play an important role in providing employment opportunities. And in terms of housing, again, the government said that it's really important to have a diverse range of inclusive housing options. But again, there wasn't a commitment to phasing these out accepted just yet. And in terms of our response, we know, as I mentioned before, that segregation is a key driver of the violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation that our community experiences. And we really need to see a firm commitment to addressing this. So I think these recommendations need to be a focus for ongoing advocacy for our community.
All right, we heard earlier a little bit about the Disability Rights Act. It's in the bureaucratic land of nowhere. What was the response from the government?
Yeah, so as you've heard this evening from Todd, the DRC made recommendations for a Disability Rights Act. And the government said that it will further consider the Royal Commission's recommendation for a Disability Rights Act, but they'll also consider the final report of a different inquiry that's been happening. And that's the inquiry of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights into Australia's human rights framework. And one of the recommendations that has come out of that, or the things they've been considering, is a Human Rights Act. So we obviously believe that the human rights of our community must be protected in Australian law, and that the government needs to prioritise fully upholding its obligations under the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities within our domestic law, so within our Australian legal framework. And this is a bit of a controversial one, because there have been, as we discussed earlier, a whole bunch of different perspectives around whether people would prefer a Disability Rights Act or a Human Rights Act. And I think the choice between these two, if we are choosing between the two, I acknowledge that there's also an argument for having both. But if we're choosing between the two, I think the choice involves balancing the need for broad, inclusive human rights protection with the need to address specific issues that people with disabilities face and the unique violations of human rights that we experience. So while a Disability Rights Act provides the opportunity for really targeted protections and empowerment for our community, it does, in my opinion, pose the risk of creating a legal framework that is kind of fragmented and doesn't reflect the fact that human rights are interrelated and that they can't be separated. And one of the other things that is really key to our position at Women with Disabilities Australia is that we believe that a Human Rights Act will better protect against intersectional human rights violations, because we represent women and girls and gender diverse people with disabilities who experience discrimination and rights violations at the intersections of both their gender and disability. So a human rights framework would recognise that intersectional discrimination. I think a Human Rights Act, if it were to really provide those targeted rights and protections for people with disabilities, would need to include some things around supported decision-making, inclusive education, and a positive duty on institutions to promote human rights. And there is a position statement that we have published. The 12 national disability representative organisations have published a position statement supporting a National Human Rights Act that really has these specific provisions for Disability Rights Act for disability rights. And I think one of the considerations behind some perspectives on this is that the proposal for a Human Rights Act might actually be a little bit further progressed, because there is a draft bill or draft legislation that's already been developed, and a lot of support for a Human Rights Act found through the inquiry into Australia's human rights framework. So that's a lot from me on a Human Rights Act and a Disability Rights Act. But I think it's a really interesting conversation, and I'm really keen to see how government responds to the inquiry into Australia's human rights framework and where we get with this legislation.
Yeah, it's incredibly interesting, and interesting to know there's already a draft legislation around the Human Rights Act. Emma, I'm keen to know from you. So these are the things that the government said they will work on, but there's no clear timeframes or any kind of clear commitments around when it's going to happen. How are you going to hold them to account?
Well, a lot of people have told me that me having a physical disability and asking questions relating to all disability topics actually gains a more honest response from a lot of politicians than if your regular Joe Blow was asking them. And so I'm making myself known in Parliament. I'm messaging all of the disability ministers and senators, media camps weekly, to anytime there's a disability related issue, no matter how big or how small. I want to know what's going on. I want to know how they're going to address it, if they're going to address it, and I don't let them just fly below the radar, because I know that it's important for everyone in our community to know.
Amazing.
To know the decisions being made about us, with or without us.
So we've got Emma there, but we're going to be talking a little bit later about some other ways we can campaign on these jungle issues. Finally, Sophie, where did we get the hard no's? What did we get an absolute no on, and it seems like the government is not going to move on?
Yeah, so this is interesting. I wanted to start with the idea of redress, and this might be a little bit misleading because we didn't get a hard no on the recommendation around redress in the Royal Commission. But I wanted to speak to a broader call from the disability community that many of our organisations and other advocates have made for a Disability Royal Commission National Redress Scheme. So the Royal Commission didn't include any recommendations relating to an overall redress and reparation scheme that would provide recognition and redress for the harms that people with disabilities have experienced. Instead, the Royal Commission provided one recommendation relating to a requirement for NDIS providers for consideration of redress. And the Australian state and territory governments accepted this recommendation in principle, with the NDIS Commission given oversight to investigating what this would look like, including the legal and regulatory implications. And our organisation is disappointed that a redress and reparation scheme hasn't been adopted. As we know, the Royal Commission heard thousands of testimonies about violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation without any recourse for their experiences, including any apology or redress for the trauma and damage that has been done. So it's disappointing that we haven't received this broader recommendation, although I do note that the recommendation that was there was accepted in principle.
And that's, of course, very different to other royal commissions that have looked into abuse, Sophie, in terms of redress schemes. So very different response there. Segregated education, there seems to be a pretty hard no there.
So this was one of the recommendations that was most controversial in relation to the phasing out of segregated or special schools. And the commissioners were really split over these recommendations, with some commissioners wanting to phase out special and segregated schools altogether, and others wanting to improve these settings and reform them. And the federal government has said that state and territory governments will continue to be responsible for making decisions about schools in their areas and jurisdictions. They have said that there is an ongoing role of specialist settings in service provision for students with disabilities. And they have noted some of the recommendations around phasing out education. This is really disappointing for the community, and I want to acknowledge the really incredible advocacy of some of the organisations that we work with in relation to education, including CIDA and Inclusion Australia, in relation to inclusive education and the journey to a segregated life that often begins in childhood and potentially with schooling. And the monitoring body for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, so the committee to the CRPD, has said that everyone has a right to inclusive education and that segregated schools aren't consistent with inclusive education. So this is a disappointing one to see.
Yes, absolutely. Disappointing is an understatement. Our third and final one on the nose is, and it sparked some conversation in the chat earlier when Todd mentioned it, a dedicated disability department, portfolio and minister. There's a hard no from the government there, and I know Emma asked the minister about it earlier. He was a no, so it's clearly off the table.
Yeah, so the Royal Commission recommended that the Australian government establish a government portfolio responsible for disability, as well as a ministerial position, so the Minister for Disability Inclusion, and also a Department of Disability, Equality and Inclusion that would be responsible for disability. And this recommendation was just noted, so there wasn't an agreement to accept this. And the government said that it already has two positions with responsibility for national disability policies and programs. And that's the Minister for Social Services and the Minister for the NDIS. I think this is a really interesting one because once again, it kind of brings up that question around targeted action for our community without having the unintended consequence of segregating disability issues. I think it sort of sits at that intersection where we want to make sure that we're not just seeing the things we experience as only disability issues, but we want to recognize that every policy, every law, every program,
Yes.
every service impacts people with disabilities, and we have specific needs that need to be met and have rights across all of these portfolio areas. So I think it's a really interesting one, and I'm really keen to keep listening to people's perspectives on this.
I have a quote above my desk that says, it's an Obama quote, and it says, every policy issue is a disability issue. So I wonder if taking that off the hands of all other ministers and making them not think about disability, whether that's the right way to go, I don't know. I'm not sold either way yet. I think every minister should have to think about disability. But onto our audience poll. We want to know overall, how do you rate the response from awesome to terrible? I think we're going to have a pretty strong response here. But I'd love some responses to come in. We haven't had any responses. So if you can jump back into the civility tool and tell us what you think from those overall responses. It's terrible to it's awesome. Let us know what you think. Maybe the slider is just not working. Oh no, we've got some movement. We're on 0.2, which is clearly terrible. But I'm guessing that's going to be the response of the night. So I'm not imagining much change from it's terrible. But if people want to let us know what they think, oh, we've got some movement to 0.6. I guess there was some progress. I think the changes to the Disability Discrimination Act are incredible. I don't know a single person with disability who hasn't faced discrimination in the workplace. So that's an incredible reform that's going to happen, but does it move it out of the terrible range? Probably not. So we're sitting at about 0.9, 0.8. We'd love to get your responses. Get on your phones. We've got more questions for you coming up, so let us know what you think. What we'd really like to know now, and this is an interesting kind of experiment, is we're going to put all the issues up on the screen, and we're going to give you 100 points to allocate to the most important issues for acting on. So you can give all of your points to one issue, or you can split it up. It's your social capital, and you can spend it how you like. So my question to you is, where should we be putting our energy? Which of the issues? You can put all your points to one issue. You can spread them out. Let us know, where do you think we should be putting our energy? It's pretty a rights act, so we combined a disability or human rights act, and segregation issues seem to be pretty high up there. A rights act is currently leading the way, but I love watching this because like forced sterilization is coming back in the game. I love a good moving interactive poll. Segregation issues obviously includes housing, ADEs, special schools. So the segregation issues, obviously all of these issues are incredibly important, but we can only put our energies into so much. So I'm just interested to see where you think our energy should go. But a rights act is staying ahead. So that's really interesting that people think that's really important. And I'm interested in the chat if you want to put if you have strong views on whether it should be a Disability Rights Act or a Human Rights Act, let us know. Put it in the chat. I'm interested, panel. Luke, is that what you thought people would say?
It certainly is a very interesting poll. I think I'm looking at the act and I'm thinking that's 35%. That's very clear win. Well, clear winner at this stage.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite surprising. Well, when I say surprising, that was interesting. That's an interesting look. But yeah, it's an interesting race.
Yeah, and what did you take from Sophie's headlines? What one stood out to you?
I think the one about sterilisation is we need to get every state on board on this. Like, that was one of the biggest things for me is, we cannot have one state or two states that agree and then have some states disagree on such an important issue, because violence against women is wrong. You cannot have a society like that in any society, but also around segregation. I agree that special schools are an interesting place, but I also think for some people with disabilities, they wouldn't survive in the mainstream school system. So it's a slippery slope. But yeah, so many great issues, so many fantastic issues.
Todd, your thoughts on what's coming through in the results and what you heard from Sophie?
It makes sense that the Rights Act is the most popular choice there, because if formulated correctly, a Rights Act has the potential to cover the other three issues. So if you devise and implement a Disability Rights Act properly, then perhaps we can address those other issues plus some others at the same time. So looking at it from a political lens, which is what I tend to do, makes sense from my point of view. And I just want to acknowledge the great work that Sophie did tonight in explaining some complex ideas very succinctly, and acknowledge the disability representative organisations who largely do some thankless work in this process and have been central to both the Disability Royal Commission and the NDIS review. So thank you for your work, Sophie. Been very much appreciated.
I'll second that.
Yeah, Sophie's a star. Thank you. And thank you for everyone for sticking with us with our technical issues. I'm keen to have a discussion about where to from here. So I'm a campaigner by heart, and that's what I love doing most, is campaigning. But I know for a fact that the stuck in the jungle bureaucratic issues that we will campaign for need a very different style of campaigning than the no issues. So getting through the issues through the bureaucratic jungle requires a lot of love. It requires people with disability, DROs, going in there and pushing and having our voices heard and making sure government is moving and continuing to go. Whereas a no campaign where you're trying to get someone from no to maybe is a different kind of forceful energy. Todd, I'm wondering whether you can talk to those different styles of campaigning.
Well, I live by the maxim of former US President Lyndon Johnson, who once said, "Power is where power goes." So what I like to do with these political campaigns is find out who has the power, what they want to do with it, and how they use it. So that gives you a greater sense of where the lay of the land is who the political players are and what issues you need to target with those political players and how to communicate with them.
Absolutely. It's about knowing who is the decision makers in this process and what drives them. But Luke, I know you were involved in the campaign to stop independent assessments, and that's a clear no campaign. Do you want to tell me why you loved that campaign?
Thanks, El. Well, I love a good old-fashioned electronic mail out. I think the independent assessments campaign was, as you said, a hard no. But I really love how we stepped up as a community and we said, no, this is not going to happen. Like I've never seen in 17 years of different organizations, but also different campaigns, a really strong fight for the community in that campaign. But all different campaigns are different.
Absolutely, and they require different strategies.
Yeah.
Sophie, I'm also keen to know from you. Well, I have two questions. Firstly, talk to me about the best campaigns for those issues that are stuck in the bureaucratic jungle, because they're different to that kind of come together and email your MP campaign that Luke just talked about. You've been involved in DROs inside government pushing things along. What are the best campaigns and how do they work for pushing along the bureaucrats?
It's a big question. I think there are a few different angles. I think these campaigns need to be disability led. They need to be led by us for us, and they sometimes it's really important to share the personal impact of things. I'm seeing that around campaigning around the draft NDIS support lists, where we're saying, hang on, these things are proposed to be excluded from the NDIS, but here's how it's a disability support for me in my personal experience. And sometimes those examples can be really important illustrations of how critical a particular change is. And I think in terms of some of these issues that are accepted in principle, but we don't yet know when we'll see the next action, I think it's really important that we ask for timeframes and clear reporting back on those timeframes so we can make sure that there is momentum, and to keep coming back to these recommendations to say, this is what was recommended, this is why, when are we going to see this action, and how can we be a part of that?
I'm also keen to know from you, Sophie, how do we make sure campaigns have a gender lens so that we're bringing women with disabilities with us on campaigns? Because campaigns are traditionally, you think back to the labour strikes, they're a male-dominated thing. How do we make sure that our campaigns have that gender lens and we are including women with disabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, the phrase and the principle, nothing about us without us, applies here as well. We need to make sure that women with disabilities are included, that our voices are centred, and that we're sharing the power in these campaigns to elevate the issues that we're experiencing and the barriers that we're experiencing. And I think when thinking about a gendered impact or a gender lens on something, we really need to ask ourselves a few questions. The first is, what do we know about how women experience disadvantage or inequality? And the second one is, what do we know about how people with disability experience disadvantage and inequality? And then we need to ask ourselves, how might this be even worse or different for women with disabilities because of the way that gender and disability and sexism and ableism interact to shape what we experience in the world? And I think it's important to remember that sometimes women with disabilities, we don't just experience more disadvantage, but we also experience unique forms of disadvantage where our gender and disability identities meet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can just tell you, as a female campaigner, you face different things than your male counterparts, and that needs to change. Emma, what's your best advice on how we get our campaigns in the media?
Look, I think again, partnering with someone who understands from lived experience is always going to be, I guess for me, preferable, because I know that that I have a better understanding of what someone of disability than someone without a disability has. So I think it's always preferable to partner with someone who understands your point of view and your fight and your message that you want to put out to the world.
Great advice. Thank you. Well, it's 8:30. That means it's time to wrap up. As always, we'd love to know your ideas for topics for future events. If you've got one, chuck it in the chat or reach out to us on social media. These open dialogues are monthly events, so we hope you join us next month for more debate and discussion. We'll take your ideas on board and let you know what next month's subject will be. Can I thank our incredible panel, Todd, Luke, and Emma, and our incredible special guest, Sophie. I've just got in the chat the question, what song made me want to stand up and dance? And in honor of Sophie, the true answer is Who Runs the World, Girls. So on that note, thank you for an engaging and lovely night. Look forward to seeing you next month. I'm Elly Desmarchelier. Good night.